if you write your styles using Sass, you've probably used the import at rule when loading your Sass partials. However, import is getting deprecated and support for it is going to be dropped sometime within the next couple of years. Instead of import, the new version of Sass has two new rules, use and forward. These rules are part of a change to make Sass more flexible and powerful. For the time being, you can still use import, but it's definitely a good time to learn this new syntax. So how do we use the new use and forward rules in our Sass files? Unfortunately, it's not just a matter of finding and replacing all your imports and calling it a day. It can be kind of confusing at first, but in this video, I'm going to show you the differences between import and use and forward, and show you exactly how to set up your Sass files. But first, a big thank you to my GitHub sponsors, specifically Clint25104 and ChideraObi, who've been sponsoring me since February. And also a thank you to Deta, who's a gold level sponsor. Sponsors help me make this free content for all of you wonderful people, and I appreciate it so much. If you're interested in being a sponsor, check out my GitHub page, linked down below. Alright, let's get into the video. So in VS Code, I have this pretty bare bones website that we're going to be working with in order to look at both the old and the new Sass syntax. So all of our Sass files are in the app.scss folder, and currently these files are using the old import rules. I also have a lib folder that has library.scss, and this is meant to act kind of like a third-party library that has styles that we want to use along with our own custom styles. I've kept all the styles pretty simple, as you can see, in order to focus more just on how to load the Sass files and the differences between the old and new ways. And as usual, I'm going to use Gulp to compile the Sass to CSS. So let's run Gulp in the command line, and it's going to generate a final CSS file in the dist folder here. So let's take a look at our Sass files. So we have our main style.scss file, and you can see that it is importing a bunch of other files. So the first one is importing the library.scss file, which we looked at. And we also have some Sass files from a util folder. So if we look in SCSS util, you can see that we have an _index.scss file, and that is loading the other files in the util folder, border radius, and breakpoints. So all these styles in util aren't actual style rules, but rather they are Sass objects, for lack of a better word. So we have Sass maps loading our breakpoints data, and then we have this mixin breakpoint and another mixin breakpoint down. Then in border radius, we just have a variable called border radius. And you might have noticed that this does match what we have in the library.scss file. And those are named the same for a reason, and we'll get more into that a little bit later in the video. So let's go back to our main style.scss file, and I'm going to show you each of these Sass styles and what actually gets compiled in the final CSS file. So first, let's comment out everything except this top line loading the library. So Control-K, Control-C to comment. That's the shortcut in VS Code. And then we're going to save. Gulp is rerunning. So let's look at the CSS file. So there's nothing in this file except for the source maps up here. And the reason for that is because it's only loading the library SCSS file. And all this has is that border radius Sass variable. So this isn't actually going to generate any CSS rules unless it is used in another rule somewhere else in our files. So now let's go back to our main Sass file and let's import the util folder. And we can see that Gulp reran again, and let's check out our CSS file here. So again, it's blank, nothing is in there, and that's again for the same reason, because util has border radius, which just has the variable, and then it has breakpoints, which are the mixins. And again, none of these are generating any actual style rules. So let's uncomment that last line to import the globals file. So now when we save, Gulp is rerunning. Let's check out our style.css file, and now there's stuff here. So these are all the styles from, in our globals, we have boilerplate, SCSS. You can see this is very close to the final CSS file. And it's also loading these CSS custom properties or variables, and that's coming from colors.scss. So this, again, is a very simple example of using Sass and then compiling to CSS. So you might be asking yourself, why do we have to replace import if it seems like everything's working? However, there are some issues that come up when we're using the import rules, and they're kind of the reason why Sass introduced the use and forward rules. So if you remember that border radius variable that we had in the boilerplate SCSS file, up here, it's setting the border radius to variable of border radius. So if we look in our final CSS file and we find that style rule, border radius is set to 0.5 rems. So where did this 0.5 rems come from? So if we go back to the files that had that border radius variable, we have library.scss, and it has a variable border radius and it's set to 0.75 rems, so that's different, right? Then if we go to our util folder, we also have the border radius SCSS file, and that has border radius set to 0.5 rems, which is what ended up happening here. So why did this happen? We have two variables with the exact same name. The answer is if we go back to our main style.scss file, we first imported the library file, and that had 0.75 rems, but then we imported the util folder, which is where the border radius SCSS file lives. So basically what happened was it first loaded the library, set border radius to 0.75 rems, but then after that it loaded our utils, which has border radius set to 0.5 rems. So you can see that the border radius that we set in our own custom styles basically overwrote what the library.scss file had, and that's why it's 0.5 rems in the final CSS file. And this is an issue, obviously this is a very simple example, but this is an issue because let's say we were using the library and we actually wanted to use the 0.75 rems in our styles. We didn't have an error or anything come up when we compiled with Gulp, telling us that we have two variables of the same name, just kind of silently overrode the 0.75 from the library with the 0.5 from our own styles. So when you're working with Sass variables, you do need to be really careful to make sure everything has a very unique name. So aside from the duplicate naming issue, there is another issue, I guess you could say, with the old import rules, and that is when you're loading, variables, mixins, or other Sass features, you need to make sure that they get loaded first in your main style.scss file before any other styles that are using them. So for example, we have all our mixins and variables in util. Then we have our boilerplate and other styles from the globals. What happens if we move globals to be loaded before the util file? So let's save that and see what happens. So you can see there's some issue down here in our terminal. And if we scroll up a little bit, Gulp is telling us there is an undefined mixin for breakpoint medium. The reason this error is happening is because the breakpoint in globals, which is in our boilerplate styles here, is getting loaded before this mixin breakpoint is even created, because it's loaded in the breakpoints SCSS file. So that's another thing that you just need to make sure that you're doing when you're working with the old import rules in Sass, and that is to make sure we move all the actual style rules that are using variables and mixins to after they get loaded. So now, if we scroll down in a terminal, there's no error anymore and everything is fine. So because of these two issues and some other issues, this is kind of why Sass has this new approach using styles with these new @rules, use, and forward. And this approach is called Sass modules. So in programming, modules are a collection of code that get imported and used by other code. Node modules are one example of this because you can install an npm package and then use that code in your JavaScript. And this is actually what we've done in our Gulp file. So this is our Gulp file, and up at the top, we're creating these new constants based on npm packages that we installed, like Gulp, Gulp Sass, Gulp Post CSS, etc. And then we can use the code from these packages in our actual Gulp file. So with Sass modules, basically each file can be considered a module in and of itself. And in some ways, it's not that different from what we've been doing with import because, we're importing these multiple partial Sass files into our main Sass file here. But Sass modules introduce some new features that are really helpful, and one of them is called namespacing. So if you want to read more about Sass modules and what this new version of Sass is, I highly recommend checking out Miriam Suzanne. She is a CSS expert who's also part of the CSS working group, which is kind of like the elders of the internet. And she has been featured on CSS Tricks, the Syntax FM podcast, various talks, and her articles on Sass modules helped me a lot when I was just trying to figure out all this stuff, because there was a little bit of a learning curve. So if you're interested, I've linked this article down below, and I highly recommend checking it out. So let's go back into our project, and I'm just going to close everything. And I do need to exit out of Gulp for now. So what we're going to do to show you the new way of doing Sass is I'm going to just copy this folder and make a new version. And then I'm going to rename the copy to Sass SCSS old, just so we keep the old import stuff. And then in the SCSS file, and then in the SCSS folder, and then in this SCSS folder, I'm going to use the new use and forward rules. So probably the biggest difference with Sass modules is that we're not going to load all the Sass files that contain variables, mixins, or functions in our main SCSS file like we've done the entire time. So we're only going to load files that contain actual style rules. So that would be the globals folder. So I'm actually going to comment out the library and then the util stuff. And then for the globals, I'm going to replace that with forward. So when we're changing this stuff, let's also go into the globals subfolder and the index file here, and we're going to replace import with forward in the same way. So now let's rerun Gulp. And oops, looks like there was an error here. Oh yeah, this is probably because of the mixin thing. Yeah, so it's saying undefined mixin. And that again is because we removed the util from here. So what I'm gonna do for now is go into the boilerplate SCSS file, and I'm actually going to comment out the code that's using the mixins and variables. So Control K, Control K, Control C, comment out, and I'll do the same thing for down here. Let's resave it and rerun Gulp. Oops, not what I wanna do, rerun Gulp. Okay, so now Gulp is running okay. Let's check out our final dist folder and the style.css file here. And it looks like the styles are getting rendered into style.css, which is great. So you can see that the forward rule seems to be very similar to the import rule, right? We're using forward globals, and then in the globals index file, we're forwarding boilerplate and colors. But what do we do about the mixins and variables and the other Sass stuff that we have in our util folder? So let's go into util and update that as well. So here's a util subfolder. And in the index file there, we're going to update the import to forward. And this will make the index file in util load breakpoint and border radius. Now let's go back to the boilerplate SCSS file and uncomment the code that we commented out earlier. So again, it's throwing this error because it can't find the mixin. So the way that we now load mixins and stuff is actually in each specific Sass file that is using the mixin or the variable that we want to load. We're going to add a new rule up at the very top. So we're going to say use, and here we're going to load the util folder. So ... go to utils, and we don't want that ending slash. And let's resave it. Now, you might have noticed that we saved and there's still the error. It still can't find that mixin breakpoint. And the reason for this is because when we use the use rule, it is loading the util styles like we did before with the import rule, but it is automatically giving it a namespace. And that namespace by default will match whatever the name of the folder is. So everything from the util folder is getting loaded with a util namespace. So what that means is that when we're using the mixin, so for example, the breakpoint mixin here, we can't just type breakpoint. We need to tell them that it's coming from the util namespace. So util.breakpoint, and we do the same thing with the border radius variable, util.borderRadius. Now let's save, and Gulp seems to be working. Let's check our final CSS file. Looks like our styles are getting loaded, and it has converted the mixin breakpoint to a media query. And the border radius variable is also getting converted to 0.5 rems. So by default, it gives you that util namespace. You can actually create a custom namespace. So let's say we don't want to type out util every time. We can say use util as u. And it can be anything. I'm just saying u. And it gave an error because we need to update the namespace in all our styles to u dot. Now we can save that, and now it's working again. Now there's another thing you can do with namespaces, and if you don't want to write any namespaces at all, you can say use util as a wildcard, and then we can get rid of the namespaces and go back to how we wrote the variables and mixins before. Gulp is working. So I wouldn't really recommend using the wildcard because it kind of defeats the purpose of having namespaces so that you can tell exactly where, this breakpoint mixin or this border radius variable came from. However, if let's say you're migrating a really large code base that has a ton of Sass files and using a lot of mixins and variables, it might just be a huge hassle to have to go in and find every single variable, mixin, and function and add that namespace to it. So I think that's the only use case that I can think of that, maybe the wildcard's a good idea. But in general, I would not do that. I would stick with the util. Add that namespace in. So going back to that border radius issue where, we were loading library with the 0.75 rems, and then we were loading, let me close these other files. We were loading the border radius SCSS file with 0.5 rems, library 0.75 rems. And if you remember, the library value was getting overridden by the border radius, our border radius value. Now the namespacing thing does fix that problem. So let's say we wanted to use the library value of border radius. We can add another use rule. So use, and then get out to the lib folder here. And I think I need to specifically say library.scss because it doesn't have an index.scss file. So add that rule. And then now we want to have border radius use library as a namespace. So, okay, everything compiled correctly. There's no errors. Let's check out our final CSS file. And we can see now that the border radius is set to 0.5 rems, which is the value from the library Sass file. So this is one example of why the namespacing in Sass is really powerful, because we can load the util styles and the library styles, and we can tell them which one we want to use for our border radius variable. So that's a really cool addition to Sass now. And so I'm pretty excited about this namespacing thing. It makes Sass, almost more programmatic. I'm not going to get into that debate of if CSS is a programming language, but it makes it more, a little bit more like object-oriented programming. So I did want to show you one kind of weird thing that I noticed when I was experimenting with use and forward. So when I was experimenting with the use and forward, I noticed that they sometimes act almost identically. So if we go to our main Sass file here, and instead of forward globals, we say use globals, we'll save that. No errors, that's good. Check out our style.css file. Everything looks pretty much the same as when we used forward. And that's, I guess, designed. So the use and the forward rules will act exactly the same if you're using them to load a file that doesn't have, a variable mixin, etc. So in some cases, you could use or forward, either one, and they'll do the same thing. But you definitely cannot use forward to load a mixin or a variable. So if we go back to boilerplate, let's say we try using forward util and save that, it's throwing an error because use is the only rule that will allow you to, access those mixins and variables and stuff. So just one kind of weird thing to keep in mind. This is kind of one reason why I like to keep all my mixins and other Sass things separate in this util folder. And then in my other styles, those are just style rules that may be using some of the stuff from the utils. But in general, I would only use forward for, loading styles. And then I would only use when we want to use a mixin or variable, etc. from another file. So the last thing I wanted to do is I wanted to show you how this new Sass syntax gets configured in Gulp, because there is a slight difference. So let's go into our Gulp file. Let's close this other stuff up, load the Gulp file. So previously, Sass had multiple implementations, which means that there was more than one way that people were converting Sass to CSS. So there was libsass, there was nodesass, which was based on libsass, and then there was dartsass, and each of those implementations had their own compiler. So in Gulp, we have a package called gulpsass, and that's what we use to compile Sass as CSS. And previously, Gulp Sass automatically came with the Node Sass compiler. However, Node Sass and libsass have both been deprecated pretty recently, and so it leaves only Dart Sass as now the default implementation of Sass. So because there were multiple implementations before, the newest version of Gulp Sass, which is version 5, it actually requires you to explicitly say which implementation you want to use. So this is why if you're using Gulp Sass version 5, you need to add this require Sass at the end of it instead of just require Gulp Sass. Let's actually delete that and just see what happens if we get rid of that. So we'll save that, exit out of Gulp, restart Gulp. And it's saying here, yeah. Where we go? So Gulp Sass 5 does not have a default Sass compiler. Please set one yourself. Both Sass, which is Dart Sass now, and Node Sass packages are permitted. And then it's telling you the syntax that you need to use. So this is why we need to require Sass up there. So that was just a small thing that if you use Gulp, you might run into this error when you're using it. So I'm guessing that in the future, Gulp Sass might update to change to not have this require Sass thing because, there's only one implementation left now. But for now, we do need to add it in. So that's a basic look at Sass modules and how to use the new use and forward rules. There are more advanced features of the new Sass modules, but I didn't cover them here. I really just wanted to focus on, how to update your import rules to using use and forward. So I hope this was helpful. Feel free to ask any questions down in the comments and I'll do my best to answer them. And again, a huge thank you to my GitHub sponsors for making tutorials like this possible. So thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.